The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Jake Morrison rode his black stallion through the Rocky Canyon. He had been traveling for 3 days, heading toward the town of Red Mesa to collect a bounty on a cattle rustler. Jake was a man who kept to himself, preferring the company of his horse and the vast emptiness of the frontier to the noise and complications of town life. Jake was 32 years old, tall and lean from years of hard living under the desert sun. His weathered face told stories of countless adventures, and his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He wore a faded brown hat that had seen better days, and his gun belt held 2 well-maintained Colt revolvers that he knew how to use better than most men. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake pulled his horse to a sudden stop. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from what looked like a military camp, but something was wrong. The smoke was too thick, and there were no sounds of normal camp activity. Jake's instincts, sharpened by years of survival on the frontier, told him to be careful. He dismounted and led his horse behind a cluster of large rocks, then crept forward on foot to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. 7 young Apache women, probably sisters based on their similar features, were tied to wooden posts in the center of the camp. They were dressed in traditional Apache clothing, but their clothes were torn and dirty. The women looked exhausted and frightened, but their eyes still held the fierce pride of their people. Around the camp, Jake counted 12 men in military uniforms, but something about them seemed off. Their uniforms were dirty and mismatched, and they carried themselves more like outlaws than proper soldiers. The leader of the group was a large man with a thick black beard and cruel eyes. He was shouting orders at the others while pointing at the captured women. Jake moved closer, using the rocky terrain to stay hidden. He could hear pieces of their conversation carried on the desert wind. The bearded man was talking about how much money they would make, and how no one would ever know what happened to the Apache sisters. Another man mentioned something about a gold mine and how the women had seen too much. The cowboy's heart pounded as he realized what he was witnessing. These weren't real soldiers at all. They were criminals dressed as military men, and they were planning to execute these innocent women to cover up some kind of illegal operation. Jake had heard rumors about corrupt military units operating in the territory, but he had never seen evidence of it himself. One of the fake soldiers walked over to the eldest sister, who appeared to be about 20 years old. She had long black hair and fierce dark eyes that reminded Jake of a wild eagle. The man grabbed her chin roughly and said something that made her spit in his face. The soldier raised his hand to strike her, but the bearded leader called him back. "Don't damage the goods yet, Martinez," the leader called out with a cruel laugh. "We'll have our fun with them before we finish the job, but first we need to make sure no one followed them here." Jake felt sick to his stomach. These men were planning something far worse than just execution. He knew he had to act, but he was outnumbered 12-1. Even with his skill with guns, those odds were almost impossible to overcome. But he couldn't just ride away and leave these women to their fate. As he watched, one of the younger sisters, probably about 16, began to cry silently. The sight of her tears made something fierce awaken in Jake's chest. He had lost his own sister to raiders when he was just a boy, and he had sworn never to let innocent people suffer if he could prevent it. Jake studied the layout of the camp carefully. The men had set up their tents in a rough circle around the captives, with their horses tied up on the far side. Most of the fake soldiers were gathered around a campfire, drinking and laughing about their plans. Only 2 men were actually watching the prisoners, and they seemed more interested in their bottle of whiskey than in doing their job properly. The sun was getting higher, and Jake knew he didn't have much time. From what he had overheard, the men were planning to move the women at sunset to a more remote location where they could carry out their evil plans without any chance of being discovered. If Jake was going to act, it had to be soon. He carefully made his way back to his horse and checked his weapons. Both revolvers were fully loaded, and he had extra ammunition in his saddlebags. He also carried a Winchester rifle that had never failed him in a tight spot. But even with all his firepower, he knew that a direct assault would likely result in the death of the women he was trying to save. Jake closed his eyes and tried to think of a better plan. He remembered his father's advice from long ago. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemies fight each other instead of you. The idea began to form in his mind. Dangerous, but possible. Looking around the area, Jake noticed that the fake soldiers had chosen their camp location poorly. They were in a narrow part of the canyon with high rock walls on both sides. If someone could create enough confusion and panic, the men might end up shooting at shadows and each other instead of identifying the real threat. Jake also noticed that the men's horses were nervous and skittish, probably because they could sense the tension in the air. Horses were smart animals, and they often reacted badly to violence and fear. If something spooked them badly enough, they might create the distraction Jake needed. As he finalized his plan, Jake took one last look at the 7 sisters tied to the posts. The eldest was whispering something to the others, probably trying to keep their spirits up in the face of their terrible situation. Her courage reminded him of stories his grandfather used to tell about brave Apache warriors who never gave up, no matter how impossible their circumstances seemed. Jake knew that what he was planning was extremely dangerous and that he might not survive the next few hours. But he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he rode away and left these women to die. Some things were more important than personal safety, and protecting innocent people from evil was one of them. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust across the canyon. In the distance, a hawk circled overhead, as if watching the drama about to unfold below. Jake took a deep breath, checked his guns one more time, and prepared to put his desperate plan into action. The lives of 7 innocent women depended on his courage, skill, and a little bit of luck. As he mounted his horse and began to ride toward his chosen position, Jake whispered a quick prayer to whatever powers might be listening. He was about to attempt something that most people would consider impossible, but sometimes impossible things were the only ones worth doing. The fake soldiers had no idea that their evil plans were about to be disrupted by a solitary cowboy who refused to let innocent people suffer. The canyon was about to become a battleground, and Jake Morrison was determined to make sure that justice would prevail, no matter what the cost to himself. Jake positioned himself on a rocky ledge about 200 yards above the fake military camp. From this height, he had a clear view of the entire area and multiple escape routes if his plan went wrong. He had tied his horse securely behind a large boulder where it would be safe from stray bullets and ready for a quick getaway if needed. The cowboy pulled out his Winchester rifle and carefully aimed at a pile of dry wood near the fake soldier's supply wagon. His plan was simple but dangerous: create maximum confusion and use the chaos to free the 7 Apache sisters. He knew he would only have a few minutes before the criminals figured out where the attack was coming from. Jake took a deep breath and fired his first shot. The bullet sparked against a metal pot near the campfire, creating a loud clang that startled everyone in the camp. Before anyone could react, he fired again, this time hitting the wooden water barrel, which exploded in a shower of splinters and water. The fake soldiers jumped to their feet, grabbing their weapons and looking around wildly. "We're under attack," shouted one of them. "Where are they shooting from?" The bearded leader, whose name Jake had learned was Captain Rodriguez, began barking orders at his men, but the echoing gunshots in the canyon made it impossible to tell where the danger was coming from. Jake fired his third shot at the ground near the horses, sending dirt flying and causing the animals to rear up in panic. The horses broke free from their ties and began running in all directions, adding to the confusion. Some of the fake soldiers chased after their mounts, while others took cover behind rocks and tents, firing wildly at imagined enemies. During the chaos, Jake noticed that the two guards watching the Apache sisters had abandoned their posts to join the fight. This was his chance. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and began climbing down the rocky cliff face, using handholds he had identified earlier. The descent was treacherous, but Jake's years of experience in rough country served him well. As he reached the bottom of the canyon, Jake could hear the fake soldiers shouting at each other in confusion and fear. "I saw muzzle flash from the north ridge," one man yelled. "No, it came from the east," another argued. Rodriguez was screaming at his men to spread out and find their attackers, but his orders only added to the pandemonium. Jake crept through the shadows at the edge of the camp, staying low and moving quickly. The eldest Apache sister saw him approaching and her eyes widened in surprise, but she had the wisdom to remain silent. Jake pulled out his knife and began cutting her ropes, working as fast as he could while keeping one eye on the confused soldiers. "Who are you?" the woman whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the shouting and gunfire. "Someone who's here to help," Jake replied quietly as he freed her hands. "Can you and your sisters run?" She nodded firmly. "We are stronger than we look, but there are 12 of them and only one of you." "I've faced worse odds," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. He moved to the next sister, a girl who looked about 18 years old. Her ropes were tighter, and his knife worked frantically to cut through them. Suddenly, one of the fake soldiers came running around a tent and spotted Jake kneeling beside the captives. The man raised his gun, but the eldest sister, now free, grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in the soldier's eyes. He stumbled backward, cursing and trying to clear his vision. Jake drew one of his Colts faster than lightning and fired once. The bullet caught the soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. The man hit the ground hard and didn't get up, though Jake could see he was still breathing. "Martinez is down!" someone shouted from across the camp. "The attackers are here!" Jake knew his time was running out. He cut the ropes binding the third sister while the first two helped free the fourth. The fake soldiers were beginning to organize themselves, and Rodriguez was leading a group of men toward the center of the camp where the prisoners were held. "This way!" Jake whispered urgently, pointing toward a narrow gap between two large rocks that led to a small ravine. "Stay low and keep moving." The 7 sisters moved with the grace and silence that came naturally to their people. Even in their weakened condition, they were far more skilled at moving quietly through rough terrain than their captors. Jake followed behind them, his guns drawn and ready for trouble. They had almost reached the safety of the ravine when Rodriguez spotted them. "There they are!" the fake captain roared. "Stop them before they escape!" Bullets began flying in their direction, ricocheting off rocks and kicking up dust around their feet. Jake turned and fired both revolvers at the approaching soldiers, forcing them to take cover and buying precious seconds for the sisters to reach safety. One of the younger sisters stumbled on the rocky ground, and Jake quickly helped her up. "Keep going!" he shouted over the noise of gunfire. "I'll hold them off!" The eldest sister stopped and looked back at him. "You cannot fight them all alone. You will die." "Maybe," Jake admitted, reloading his guns with practiced speed. "But at least you'll be free." She stared at him for a moment, as if trying to understand why a stranger would risk his life for people he had never met. Then she nodded with respect and led her sisters toward the safety of the ravine. Jake took position behind a large boulder and began returning fire at the fake soldiers. His shots were accurate and deadly, and 2 more of Rodriguez's men went down. But the others were beginning to surround his position, and he knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. That was when the eldest sister reappeared at his side, carrying a rifle she had taken from one of the wounded soldiers. "My name is Ayanna," she said calmly as she aimed and fired at their enemies. "And Apache women do not abandon those who help us." "You should be running," Jake protested, but he had to admit he was grateful for her help. Ayanna was an excellent shot, and her presence doubled his firepower. "My sisters are safe in the ravine," she replied, firing again. Now we finish this together." The battle became intense as Rodriguez and his remaining men launched a desperate assault on Jake and Ayanna's position. Bullets flew in both directions, and the air filled with gun smoke and dust. Jake's ammunition was running low, but Ayanna had found extra bullets on the soldiers she had taken down. Rodriguez himself charged toward their boulder, firing his pistol and screaming with rage. Jake stood up to meet him, and the two men faced each other across 20 feet of desert sand. Both fired at the same moment, but Jake's aim was true while Rodriguez's shot went wide. The fake captain fell backward, his hand clutching his chest, his evil plans finally at an end. The remaining fake soldiers, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat toward the far end of the canyon. Some were wounded, others were simply terrified by the fierce resistance they had encountered. Jake let them go, more concerned with making sure all 7 sisters were safe than with pursuing fleeing criminals. Ayanna called out in Apache, and her 6 sisters emerged from the ravine. They gathered around Jake and Ayanna, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude, relief, and amazement at their unexpected rescue. The youngest sister, who couldn't have been more than 14, walked up to Jake and spoke to him in Apache. Ayanna translated with a small smile. "She says you fight like a warrior, but your heart is kind like a medicine man. She wants to know if you are real or if you are a spirit sent by our ancestors." Jake couldn't help but grin at that. "Tell her I'm real enough and that I'm just glad you're all safe." As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, Jake knew their troubles weren't over yet. They still had to get the sisters back to their people, and there might be more criminals in the area. But for now, they had won an important victory against evil, and 7 innocent lives had been saved. The fake military uniforms scattered around the camp would provide evidence of the corruption Jake had uncovered, and the territorial authorities would need to know about this criminal operation. But first, he had to make sure Ayanna and her sisters reached safety. As they gathered supplies from the abandoned camp, Jake couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed in just one day. He had started the morning as a solitary bounty hunter, but now he found himself responsible for 7 brave young women who had already shown more courage than most men he knew. The real adventure, he realized, was just beginning. 3 days after the rescue, Jake and the 7 Apache sisters made camp near a natural spring hidden deep in the mountains. The sisters had insisted on traveling together, explaining that they needed to reach their tribal council with urgent information about what they had witnessed. Jake had agreed to escort them, partly out of concern for their safety, and partly because he was curious about the criminal conspiracy they had uncovered. Around the evening campfire, Ayanna finally told Jake the full story of what had happened to her and her sisters. She spoke in clear English, which she had learned from missionaries, while her sisters listened and occasionally added details in Apache. 3 weeks ago, we were gathering medicinal plants in the sacred valley near Copper Canyon, Ayanna began, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. It is a place where our people have gone for healing herbs for many generations. But when we arrived, we found white men digging in the earth with machines and explosives. Jake listened carefully as she continued. These men wore military uniforms, so at first we thought they might have permission from the government. But something felt wrong. They were destroying sacred places and poisoning the water with their mining operations. We hid in the rocks and watched them for 2 days. The second eldest sister, whose name was Halona, spoke in Apache, and Ayanna translated. She says the men were taking gold and silver from the mountain, but they were also doing something else. They had boxes of weapons and ammunition hidden in the mine, and men came every few days to collect them. "Gun runners," Jake muttered, his suspicions beginning to form into a clear picture. "They were using a fake military operation to cover up weapons smuggling." Ayanna nodded gravely. "We overheard them talking about selling guns to hostile tribes and outlaws throughout the territory. They planned to start a war between the Apache and the white settlers, then make money by selling weapons to both sides. Jake felt his anger rising as he understood the full scope of the evil plot. Starting a war for profit was one of the most despicable crimes he could imagine, especially when it involved destroying the lives of innocent families on both sides of the conflict. "How did they capture you?" he asked. The third sister, Kiona, spoke up in broken English. "We tried to leave, warn our people, but they had guards watching the trails. They caught us on the second night and brought us to their camp in the canyon. Rodriguez told us we had seen too much," Ayana continued. "He said they would kill us and make it look like we were killed by rival tribes. That way our deaths would help start the war they wanted." Jake shook his head in disgust. "And the real military had no idea what was happening?" "Rodriguez showed us papers that looked official," Helona said through Ayana's translation. "But now I think they were forgeries. The men behaved nothing like real soldiers. They drank too much, they were cruel to prisoners, and they cared only about money." As the fire crackled and the desert night grew cooler, Jake began to piece together the full conspiracy. A group of criminals had disguised themselves as a military unit and set up an illegal mining and weapons smuggling operation in remote Apache territory. They planned to eliminate any witnesses and start a profitable war in the process. "There's more," Ayana said quietly. "Rodriguez received messages from someone he called the General. This person seemed to be giving him orders and sending him money. We think there are other fake military units operating in different parts of the territory." Jake's blood ran cold at this revelation. If there were multiple criminal groups posing as legitimate military forces, the entire territorial government could be infiltrated with corruption. Innocent people across the frontier would be in danger from these fake soldiers who answered to no law except greed. The youngest sister, Apache, suddenly pointed toward the edge of their camp and spoke urgently in Apache. Everyone immediately went silent and listened carefully. In the distance, they could hear the sound of horses approaching their hidden location. Jake drew his guns and motioned for the sisters to take cover behind the rocks near the spring. He had chosen this campsite carefully because it was easily defended, but he hadn't expected to be followed so quickly. Either some of Rodriguez's men had survived and tracked them, or there were other criminals in the area looking for the escaped prisoners. "Stay down and stay quiet," Jake whispered to Ayana. "If anything happens to me, take your sisters and follow the stream north until you reach the old Apache trail. That will lead you home." Ayana gripped his arm firmly. "We do not abandon friends," she said with fierce determination. The approaching horses stopped about 50 yards from their camp, and Jake could hear men's voices talking in low tones. From what he could make out, there were at least 4 riders, and they seemed to be discussing whether to attack immediately or wait until morning. Jake crept closer to the edge of the camp, using the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. Through the shadows, he could see 4 men dismounting from their horses. They wore civilian clothes, but something about their bearing and equipment suggested they were connected to the fake military operation. One of the men held up what looked like a piece of paper and studied it by moonlight. "Rodriguez said the prisoners might head for this area," he said in a voice just loud enough for Jake to hear. "The general wants them found and eliminated before they can reach their tribe with information about our operations." "What about the man who helped them escape?" another voice asked. "Kill him too," the first man replied coldly. "We can't afford to have any witnesses to what Rodriguez was doing. The whole operation depends on keeping our activities secret until we're ready to start the war." Jake had heard enough. These men were definitely part of the larger conspiracy, and they weren't going to give up their pursuit easily. He made his way back to where the sisters were hiding and quickly explained the situation. 4 men, he whispered. They're part of the same organization as Rodriguez. They're planning to attack at first light, which gives us about 6 hours to prepare. Ayana consulted with her sisters in rapid Apache, then turned back to Jake. "We know this area well," she said. "There is an old mine shaft about half a mile from here that leads to a network of caves. We could hide there, or we could use it to set a trap. Jake considered their options carefully. Running would only delay the inevitable, as these men would continue hunting them across the territory. But fighting 4 armed criminals was extremely dangerous, especially when he had to protect 7 women at the same time. "Tell me about this mine shaft," he said finally. Ayanna smiled grimly. "It was abandoned by miners 20 years ago, but we used to play in the caves when we were children. There is only one entrance, but there are many tunnels inside. A person could hide there for weeks without being found. Or a person could create an ambush that the attackers would never see coming," Jake added, beginning to understand the possibilities. The sisters quickly gathered their few possessions, while Jake studied the layout of the area by moonlight. The mine entrance was positioned perfectly for what he had in mind. If he could lure the 4 men into the narrow tunnel, their superior numbers would become a disadvantage rather than an asset. As they made their way toward the old mine, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the courage of the 7 sisters. They had already endured capture, imprisonment, and a dangerous rescue, but they were still willing to fight rather than simply hide from their enemies. Their bravery reminded him of why he had risked his life to save them in the first place. The mine entrance was partially hidden by fallen rocks and desert vegetation, exactly as Ayanna had described. Jake spent an hour setting up his ambush, while the sisters positioned themselves in the safety of the deeper tunnels. Everything depended on timing and accuracy, but Jake had faced similar situations before and survived. As dawn approached, Jake could hear the 4 men beginning their search for the camp. They were moving methodically through the area, checking every possible hiding place. It wouldn't be long before they discovered the mine entrance. Jake checked his weapons one final time and settled into his chosen position. Behind him in the tunnels, 7 brave Apache sisters waited to see if their unlikely champion could triumph once again against overwhelming odds. The conspiracy that had nearly cost them their lives was about to face its final test, and Jake Morrison was determined to make sure that justice would prevail. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the rocky walls of the mine entrance. The confrontation that would determine the fate of all 8 survivors was about to begin, and the outcome would expose the truth about the savage frontier plot that threatened to engulf the entire territory in war.